Welcome to our deep dive into economics.
Right.
We're going to be taking an economics textbook and breaking down, I guess, the core ideas
Okay.
into something you can actually use
Yeah,
in your everyday life.
absolutely.
You know, economics kind of gets a bad rap for being dry, but trust me, once you understand the basics,
Yeah.
you start to see how it plays into, like, practically everything.
It's true.
Yeah.
Economics is really just the study
Yeah.
of how people make decisions, especially when they can't have
Yeah.
everything they want.
Right, because we all have limited resources,
Yeah.
whether it's, time, money, even just like energy. Recently, I was actually trying to decide whether to like buy a new phone or save up for a trip. And I was like, man, this is like a real life economics problem. Like,
Yeah.
how do you explain this idea of scarcity and choice in the textbook?
Well, one way to illustrate it is to compare life today with, say, like
Okay.
pioneer days. Back then, people had to be incredibly self-sufficient, building their homes, growing their own food, making their clothes.
Wow.
It was a ton of work,
I can't even imagine having to do all that myself.
right?
I can barely keep a houseplant alive, so how did we go from that to the world we live in today?
Through the division and specialization of labor.
Okay.
Instead of each of us trying to do everything, we focus on what we're good at
Yeah.
and trade for the rest.
Right.
You're great at writing podcast scripts.
I try.
I'm good at analyzing economic trends
Yeah.
and so on.
So in a way, like, our individual self-interest actually helps create a more efficient system for everyone.
Exactly. Adam Smith,
Oh, okay.
a famous economist, called this the invisible hand.
Invisible hand.
Yeah, it's this fascinating idea that when individuals pursue their own interests,
Right.
it can actually lead to a better outcome for society as a whole.
Okay.
Think about the tech industry, for instance. Companies compete fiercely to create the best products.
Yeah.
And as a result, we get incredible innovations like smartphones and the internet.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's like competition, even if it's driven by, like,
Yes.
self-interest, can actually push us all forward.
Precisely.
Okay.
Now, the study of economics is often broken down into two main branches,
Okay.
microeconomics and macroeconomics.
Okay.
Microeconomics focuses on individual decision-making,
Okay.
things like how consumers choose what to buy or how businesses decide how much to produce.
Got it.
Yeah,
So microeconomics is like looking at the individual trees in the forest.
great analogy.
Yeah.
And it uses concepts like supply and demand,
Okay.
which we'll talk about in a bit,
Yeah.
to understand how prices are determined and how markets function.
Got it.
Macroeconomics, on the other hand, zooms out to look at the entire forest.
Okay.
It's concerned with the big picture stuff. National income, employment, inflation,
Okay.
and overall economic growth.
Yeah.
So micro is the individual pieces. Macro is how those pieces all fit together
Exactly.
to create the big economic picture.
Yeah.
Now, before we dive into like the nitty-gritty of supply and demand,
Sure.
there's this concept of opportunity cost
Yes.
that the textbook really emphasized.
Opportunity cost is a crucial
Yeah.
concept in economics.
Right.
It's basically the idea that choosing one thing means giving up something else.
Okay.
Every decision comes with a trade-off.
Okay, that makes sense. But could you give me an example?
Sure.
I'm a little bit of a visual learner.
Imagine you're trying to decide whether to spend your Saturday studying for a big exam
Okay.
or going out with friends.
Okay.
Choosing to study means you might get a better grade,
Yeah.
but you miss out on the fun and social time with your friends.
Right.
That fun is the opportunity cost of choosing to study.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So it's not just about the money I spend,
Right.
but also about the experiences or opportunities I might miss out on. Exactly. And the more you want of one thing,
Yeah.
the more you might have to give up of something else.
Okay.
The textbook uses a tool called the Production Possibilities Frontier,
Okay.
or PPF, to illustrate this.
All right.
Imagine a graph that shows all the different combinations of, say, cars
Okay.
and computers that a country can produce given its resources.
Okay.
If they want to make more cars,
Yeah.
they might have to sacrifice
Okay.
some computer production.
So it's like a visual representation
Yes.
of those trade-offs.
Exactly.
It makes me think about decisions like going to college.
Sure.
You're giving up years of potential income
Right.
to, invest in your education.
Right.
Is it worth the opportunity cost?
Absolutely.
That's a tough one.
And that's where economics comes in.
Yeah.
It helps you analyze those trade-offs and figure out the best choice
Okay.
for your specific goals and circumstances.
That's super helpful.
Yeah.
Now, I'm really curious about this whole supply and
Okay.
demand thing, which the textbook called
The big one.
yeah, like the cornerstone of economics.
Yeah.
What makes it so important?
Well, supply and demand is basically how we determine the prices of things
Okay.
and how much of those things are bought and sold.
Okay.
It's the foundation of how markets work.
Okay. But can you break that down a bit further?
Of course.
Yeah.
Let's say there's a sudden increase in the price of coffee.
Okay.
Consumers might start buying less coffee because it's more expensive.
Right.
At the same time, coffee producers might see this higher price
Okay.
as an opportunity to make more money.
Yeah.
So they might start producing more coffee.
So the price affects both how much people want to buy
Exactly.
and how much producers want to sell.
Exactly. And the point where those two forces balance out,
Okay.
where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded,
Okay.
is what we call the equilibrium price.
Equilibrium price.
Yes.
Got it.
Like a constant tug of war
Okay.
between buyers and sellers.
So the equilibrium price is like the sweet spot where everyone's kind of happy.
Exact.
The buyers are getting a decent price and the sellers are making a profit.
It's a point of balance in the market.
Okay.
You know, this reminds me of when I was in college and I tried to sell my old textbooks.
Uh-huh.
I thought I could get a pretty good price for them,
Yeah.
but I ended up having to lower it way more than I expected
Right.
to find any buyers.
Uh-huh. That sounds like a real-world economics lesson.
It was.
It's funny how these concepts show up everywhere.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, we touched on monopolies earlier,
Yes.
but the textbook also mentions things like perfect competition
Right.
and monopolistic competition.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Well, perfect competition is kind of the ideal scenario
Okay.
in economics.
Uh-huh.
It's where you have tons of small businesses selling the same product,
Okay.
and none of them have enough power to influence the price.
Right.
Think of something like a farmer's market.
Okay.
Each farmer is selling pretty much the same produce,
Yeah.
so they have to compete on price and quality.
So perfect competition is all about keeping prices low
Yeah.
and giving consumers lots of choices.
Right, but perfect competition is pretty rare in the real world.
Okay.
More often you see things like monopolistic competition.
Okay.
This is where you have many sellers,
Mm-hmm.
but they offer products that are slightly different from each other.
Okay.
Like in the market for jeans,
Okay.
you have so many brands,
All right.
each with their unique style, fit, and price point.
So it's still competitive, but each company has a little bit more control over their prices
Exactly.
because they're not selling exactly the same thing.
Exactly. And that product differentiation allows them to charge a bit more
Right.
than they could in a perfectly competitive market.
Okay.
They're not just competing on price, they're also competing on style and branding.
This reminds me of that time I tried to buy tickets to a concert, and they sold out in like minutes.
Yeah.
I would have paid way more than the face value
Right.
just to get in. Do you think that's related to this whole idea of consumer surplus?
Yes, consumer surplus is basically the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for something
Okay.
and what they actually pay.
Okay.
In your concert ticket example, you were willing to pay more than face value,
Yeah.
which means you would have had a lot of consumer surplus
Right.
if you'd gotten a ticket.
So the people who snagged those tickets got a good deal,
Yeah.
at least from an economics perspective.
Right.
What about the producers? Do they have a surplus too?
They do. Producer surplus is the difference between the price producers receive for a good
Okay.
and the minimum price they'd be willing to accept.
Got it.
It's their profit margin, essentially.
Okay, that makes sense. But the textbook also mentions something about price controls, like rent control, and how they can sometimes backfire.
Right.
How does that tie into this?
Well, when the government tries to control prices, it can disrupt the natural balance
Okay.
of supply and demand. Rent control is a good example.
Okay.
Setting a price ceiling on rent might seem like a good way to help renters,
Right.
but it can actually lead to a shortage
Really?
of affordable housing.
Wait, why would that happen?
Think about it from the landlord's perspective.
Okay.
If they can't charge market rent,
Yeah.
they might not have as much incentive to maintain their properties
Right.
or build new ones.
Okay.
This can lead to fewer available apartments,
Mm-hmm.
and the ones that are available might not be in great condition.
So trying to help renters might actually hurt them in the long run.
It is.
That's a bit counterintuitive.
And it highlights the fact that even well-intentioned policies
Yeah.
can have unintended consequences,
Right.
especially when they interfere with the fundamental forces of supply and demand.
This is all really making me think about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
How do governments decide which economic policies to implement?
Yeah.
How do they weigh the potential trade-offs?
It's a complex issue.
It seems like there's always a debate about more government intervention versus less.
You're right. There are many different schools of thought
Mm-hmm.
in economics.
Yeah.
Each with their own perspectives on the role of government.
Okay.
Some economists believe the government should play a more active role in regulating markets and providing social safety nets,
Okay.
while others believe in a more hands-off approach,
Right.
trusting the invisible hand
Right.
to guide the economy.
So there's no one right answer.
It depends.
It depends on the specific circumstances
Yeah,
and what goals you're trying to achieve.
exactly. It's all about understanding the trade-offs
Mm-hmm.
and choosing the policies that are most likely to lead to the desired outcome.
This is reminding me of our earlier discussion about incentives.
Yes.
Don't governments themselves also respond to incentives?
You're absolutely right.
Even if those incentives aren't always aligned with like the best interests of the economy?
Politicians, like anyone else,
Right.
respond to incentives. They might be motivated by re-election public approval
Okay.
or even pressure from special interest groups.
Ah, those special interest groups.
Right.
It seems like they're always trying to influence policy
Yeah,
to benefit themselves,
Yeah.
even if it's at the expense of the broader economy.
it's true. And it's a challenge for policymakers
Right.
to balance the needs of different groups
Yeah.
and make decisions that benefit society as a whole.
Okay.
Sometimes the best economic policy might not be the most politically popular one.
It sounds like a tricky balancing act.
It is.
Speaking of balancing acts,
Mhm.
I'm really intrigued by this idea of globalization.
Mm.
It seems like it's everywhere these days.
It is.
But how does it tie into economics?
Well, globalization is essentially the increasing interconnectedness
Okay.
of the world's economies.
Okay.
It's driven by things like international trade, the flow of capital,
Mm-hmm.
and advancements in technology and communication.
Right.
And it's all underpinned by the same economic principles we've been discussing.
Like what?
Well, for example, international trade is largely based on the idea of comparative advantage.
Okay.
This means that even if a country is better at producing everything,
Mm-hmm.
it still makes sense for them to specialize in what they're most efficient at
Okay.
and trade for the rest.
So it's like how I specialize in writing podcast scripts,
Exactly.
even though I could probably learn to do other things,
Right.
just not as well.
And on a national level, this means that countries can focus on producing the goods and services
Okay.
where they have a comparative advantage,
Right.
leading to greater overall production and lower costs for everyone involved.
Okay. That makes sense. But if free trade is generally beneficial,
Right.
why is there so much controversy and debate surrounding it? It
Yeah.
seems like some people are really opposed to globalization.
You're right. It's a complex issue.
Yeah.
While free trade can lead to overall economic gains,
Mm-hmm.
there can be winners and losers in the process.
Okay.
Some industries and workers might suffer when faced with competition from foreign producers.
So it's not all sunshine and roses.
Of course.
There are potential downsides.
And that's why governments sometimes implement protectionist policies,
Okay.
like tariffs or quotas,
Mm-hmm.
to try to protect domestic industries from foreign competition.
But haven't we already established that free trade is usually the best way to go? Wouldn't those protectionist policies just hurt everyone in the long run?
It's not always that simple.
Yeah.
While free trade generally leads to lower prices for consumers and greater economic efficiency,
Okay.
those benefits are often spread widely,
Mm-hmm.
while the costs of competition are concentrated in specific industries or communities.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So the winners might not even notice the lower prices.
Right.
While the losers are hit hard with job losses or lower wages.
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay.
And that creates a real dilemma for policymakers.
Right.
They have to weigh the overall benefits of free trade
Yeah.
against the potential harm it can cause to certain groups. And of course, political considerations often play a role as well.
It sounds like economics is always intertwined
It is.
with politics and social issues.
Economics is about human choices,
Right.
and those choices are always influenced by a complex web of factors.
This has been a really insightful conversation.
It has.
I feel like we've barely scratched the surface,
We have.
but we've covered so much ground already.
We have, from scarcity and opportunity cost
Mm-hmm.
to supply and demand, market structures, and globalization.
Mm-hmm.
We've explored some of the fundamental principles of economics.
And I've learned that economics isn't just about dry theories and models.
Well said.
It's about understanding how the world works, the choices we make,
Right.
and the impact of those choices on ourselves and others.
Yes.
And just like in economics, we've reached a point of equilibrium
Us.
where it's time to wrap up part 2.
A fitting analogy.
Welcome back to our deep dive into economics.
Yeah.
We've gone from scarcity and opportunity costs
Right.
all the way to globalization. It feels like there's been one major theme kind of running through all this, right?
Right. No matter what economic system or situation we're talking about,
Yeah.
incentives had a huge impact.
Yeah, it's like that saying, follow the money.
Right.
But it's really about following the motivation
Yes.
behind any choice.
Absolutely.
Why are incentives so powerful?
Well, think about it this way.
Okay.
If you're rewarded for doing something,
Yeah.
you're more likely to do it again.
Right.
And if you get penalized,
Yeah.
you'll probably avoid it.
Yeah.
It's basic human nature. And it applies to every level of the economy.
So if we want to understand why people, businesses, or even governments
Yes.
make the decisions they do,
Right.
we need to figure out what's motivating them.
Exactly. And that's why economists spend so much time studying incentives.
Okay.
It helps us predict how people might respond to different policies or changes in the market.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that incentives apply to governments, too.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that?
Of course.
Okay.
Politicians and government officials are people, too.
Yeah.
And they respond to incentives just like anyone else.
So are you saying that they might not always act in the best interests of the economy?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
But their incentives might not always align perfectly with what's best for everyone.
Okay.
For example, a politician might be tempted to support a policy that's popular with voters,
Okay.
even if economists say it's a bad idea.
It's like that time I put off studying for a test because I wanted to go to a party.
Yeah.
Short-term fun.
Yeah.
Over long-term gains.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
We all face those kinds of trade-offs.
Right.
And for a politician, getting reelected might be a more immediate concern than the long-term health of the economy.
It also makes me think about those special interest groups we discussed earlier.
Yes.
They're really good at creating incentives for politicians to support policies that benefit them.
Yes.
Even if it's not in the best interest of the general public.
Right. They might offer campaign contributions, endorsements, or even threaten to run attack ads.
Wow.
It can be a very persuasive form of incentive.
So understanding these incentives can make us more informed citizens.
Absolutely.
It helps us see why certain policies are proposed.
Right.
And who stands to benefit from them.
And speaking of informed citizens,
how
can we use this knowledge about incentives to make better decisions in our own lives?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It feels like this whole deep dive has been about giving our listener the tools to understand not just the economy, but how their own choices fit into it.
I agree.
Yeah.
First, it's important to be aware of the incentives
that
are influencing your own behavior.
Right.
Are you spending money on things because you truly value them? Or are you being swayed by advertising? Are you using your time in a way that aligns with your long-term goals?
Sometimes I realize I've spent way too much on online shopping just because I saw a targeted ad.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
Once you're more conscious of the incentives driving your decisions, you can start to make more deliberate choices that align with your values and goals.
So step one is recognizing those hidden incentives.
Yes.
What else can we do?
Another powerful tool is to create your own incentives. If you're trying to save money, you could set up a system where you reward yourself for reaching certain milestones. Or if you're trying to form a new habit, you could find a way to make it more enjoyable. Or rewarding.
It's like designing a little economic system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the more you understand the power of incentives, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the complexities of the economic world. Whether you're making personal financial decisions or evaluating government policies.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new framework for understanding how the world works.
I agree.
Any final thoughts for our listener before we sign off?
Yes, remember, economics is ultimately about human choices. And the forces that shape those choices, by understanding the basic principles, you can make better decisions for yourself. Navigate the complexities of the market. And become a more engaged and informed citizen.
I love that.
Yeah.
And always remember, there's always more to learn.
There is.
Economics is a constantly evolving field.
Absolutely.
So stay curious, keep asking questions, and enjoy the journey.
Well said.
Thanks so much for joining me on this fascinating exploration of economics.
My pleasure.
And to our listener, we hope you found this deep dive insightful and empowering.
Yes.
Now go out there and apply your newfound knowledge to the world.